The North Yuba Murmurs. Part 1, The Drive into the Dark. The night of February 24, 1978, was supposed to be nothing more than a celebrated, slightly rowdy conclusion to a local basketball tournament. For the five men, friends bonded by shared routine, quiet strength, and the unique challenges life had assigned them, it was a cherished ritual. They were the Gateway Boys, named for the center in Oroville, California, where they lived and worked, a place that understood their specific needs and nurtured their simple, profound sense of community. The names of the men were known and loved within their tight-knit circles. Gary Mathias, the gentle giant, 25, his frame imposing but his demeanor shy, often lost in quiet contemplation. Jack Madruga, 30, the eldest and the group's de facto leader and chauffeur, known for his pristine 1969 Mercury Montego. Bill Sterling, 29, perpetually optimistic and easily excitable, his laughter booming and infectious. Teddy Weiher, 26, the quiet one, whose attention was easily captured by the smallest details of the world around him. And finally, Jackie Hewitt, 24, whose small stature belied a spirited, almost mischievous core. All five were men with intellectual disabilities, navigating a world that often misunderstood their purity of spirit. That Friday evening, the air was crisp, the temperature dropping fast toward a bitter freeze that the Sierra Nevada foothills often delivered. Jack Madruga had polished his turquoise and white Montego. It was his pride, a vessel of freedom. The plan was simple, mapped out weeks ago. Drive the 50 miles from Oroville across the sparse, winding roads of the Plumas National Forest to the city of Chico. There, they would cheer on the UC Davis team in the championship game, maybe grab a celebratory burger, and be back home before the clock struck midnight. They set off in high spirits. The car radio, tuned to a static-laced country music station, hummed beneath their excited chatter. Jack, his hands steady on the wheel, led the way. Bill Sterling, already imagining the victory, tapped a restless rhythm against the door panel. Gary, characteristically, was silent, his gaze fixed on the endless pine trees blurring past the window, the darkness already gathering an impenetrable thickness. The initial leg of the journey was smooth, but as they left the familiar glow of Oroville behind, the landscape grew rapidly hostile. The road, Highway 70, began its slow, serpentine climb into the mountains. Snow lay in patches off the shoulder, a warning of the treacherous conditions higher up. It was here, in the deepening gloom, that their journey first began to deviate from the planned route. They missed the turnoff for Chico. It was a mistake easily made, especially in the dark, and perhaps complicated by the subtle cognitive challenges each man faced in navigating unfamiliar territory. Instead of correcting, Jack kept the car on the main artery. They were now heading not toward Chico, but further north and east, deeper into the remote, sparsely populated stretches of Plumas County. It wasn't until they saw the sign for Yuba Pass that one of them, most likely Teddy, whose focus on direction was surprisingly sharp, pointed out the error. Panic, a low, buzzing fear, began to creep into the Mercury's cabin. Jack pulled over abruptly, the tires spitting gravel onto the frozen verge. The five friends huddled together, their excitement replaced by a mutual confusion that bordered on distress. They had limited cash, limited understanding of where exactly they were, and an increasing awareness of the cold that was now aggressively seeping into the car. Jack, consulting a badly creased map he kept in the glove compartment, determined they were miles off course, on a road that seemed to only lead higher into the mountains, toward a place called Forbestown. It was a decision born of confusion and a desire to simply keep moving, to avoid sitting stagnant in the mountain cold. Jack turned the car around. They drove south for a while, desperately searching for a familiar landmark or a sign pointing toward Chico. The minutes dragged, transforming into an hour of aimless driving on increasingly secondary and unmaintained roads. Around 10 p.m., they found themselves on a narrow, heavily forested track, a logging road that ascended steeply into the high Sierra. It was here, on a desolate, snow-covered stretch near the Kidd Creek Reservoir, that the Mercury Montego ground to a halt. Not because of a mechanical failure, but because Jack, for reasons never to be fully understood, stopped the car. He pulled the car to the side of the road, the headlights piercing the solid blackness of the pine woods. The interior of the car was warm, the gas tank still half full. In the back seat were snacks, a half-eaten bag of potato chips, sodas, and candy, enough to sustain them for a day or more. Crucially, the engine was running, and the key was in the ignition. Yet Jack turned the engine off. Silence. A profound, heavy silence, broken only by the settling tick of the cooling engine block and the far-off, mournful howl of the mountain wind. "Why stop, Jack?" Bill Sterling, his optimism finally waning, asked the question that hung heavy in the air. Jack didn't answer immediately. He was staring out the windshield, his gaze fixed on something the others couldn't see, something beyond the cone of the headlights. His face, usually placid and reliable, was etched with a sudden, inexplicable alarm. Then he reached for the key, not to restart the engine but to turn it one last, decisive notch. The radio died, the lights went out. The Mercury Montego was swallowed by the blackness. What happened in the next few minutes would become the eternal, unsolvable riddle of the Gateway Boys. Did they see a light? Did they hear a voice? Did a vehicle pull up beside them? No one knows. But a critical, terrifying choice was made. They exited the car. They left behind the warmth, the food, the safety of the Montego. They left the key on the floor mat, a strange, almost ceremonial abandonment. They left behind the championship game, the burgers, the certainty of home. They stepped out into the biting, sub-zero air, clad only in light jackets and jeans, unprepared for a moment of crisis, let alone a night in the wilderness. 5 shadows, 5 figures of confusion and rising fear, stood on the desolate logging road. Gary Mathias, the silent one, looked back at the comforting shape of the car for the last time. He saw its silent protest against the cold, its metallic surfaces already beginning to frost over. He knew instinctively that this was wrong, but he followed his friends, drawn by the invisible, terrifying compulsion that had pulled Jack from the driver's seat. They did not walk down the road. They did not walk toward the distant promise of a town. They walked up. They began a steep ascent into the denser, higher reaches of the Plumas National Forest, straight into the unforgiving, light-devouring maw of the wilderness. They walked not as men lost and seeking help, but as men driven by an urgent, unseen command. The last trace of them was the whisper of their footsteps on the thin, frozen layer of snow, heading away from the road, away from civilization, and away from any hope of rescue. The Montego was found 4 days later. It was pristine, locked, and fully capable of driving. The only thing missing was the 5 men, the key, and the chilling truth of what made them leave the safety of the car and walk into the dark, frozen forest. The calendar rolled over into February 25th, then 26th, and then 27th. The championship game was over, the celebratory burgers forgotten. In Oroville, a frantic, agonizing search had begun. The families of the 5 men, their unique vulnerabilities amplifying the terror, were in constant, desperate contact with the Butte County Sheriff's Department. Initially, the police viewed it as a simple missing persons case, likely an accident or a wrong turn that would be solved with a simple patrol. But as the days of bitter cold piled up, and no word came, the official mood shifted from concern to grim urgency. The search teams, primarily focused on the established roads leading toward Chico, scoured every diner, gas station, and rest stop. Jack Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego was a noticeable car, turquoise with a white top, yet it remained an elusive ghost in the sprawling, indifferent landscape of Northern California. Then, on Tuesday, February 28th, for days after the boys vanished, the first piece of the puzzle was discovered, not by the professional search parties, but by a local man named Johnny Baxter. Baxter was driving his snowmobile on an obscure, steep logging road near the settlement of Forbestown, an area well outside the established search grid. He wasn't looking for missing people. He was simply checking on a remote cabin he owned. Around 4 p.m., as the mountain shadows stretched long and cold, he saw it. a familiar splash of turquoise against the stark white and gray of the winter woods. It was the Montego. Baxter stopped his snowmobile, the engine dying into the oppressive silence of the forest. The car was parked neatly off the main track, angled slightly into the dense pine trees. Snow had drifted against the tires, but the vehicle was otherwise untouched, preserved in the icy conditions like a relic. The mystery wasn't that the car was there. The mystery was the sheer context of its location. This road was seasonal, unmaintained, and led nowhere of consequence, not to a major city, not to a highway, only deeper into the high, unforgiving elevations of the Plumas National Forest. It was a road that, as the investigators would later determine, Jack Madruga had absolutely no rational reason to be on. Baxter approached the vehicle cautiously. The driver's side door was unlocked. He peered inside. The interior was immediately unnerving. All 4 passenger doors were slightly ajar, suggesting a hasty, collective exit. More disturbingly, the keys were missing, but the engine was cold and silent. The back seat held the remnants of a planned fun night: crumpled chip bags, soft drink cans, and the ticket stubs for the now long-past basketball game. Critically, there was a supply of 8 full-size chocolate bars and several unopened packets of chewing gum. More than enough caloric energy to sustain 5 men for several days. The biggest, most bewildering detail was not the presence of food, but its neglect. The men had been in freezing temperatures, possibly stranded for nearly 100 hours, yet they had not touched the food, nor had they attempted to take shelter back inside the car once the engine was off. Baxter immediately contacted the sheriff's department. Within the hour, a convoy of patrol cars, search and rescue vehicles, and forensic teams was struggling up the treacherous logging road. The arrival of the professionals confirmed the eerie facts. The car was mechanically sound, the gas tank 3/4 full. The only sign of struggle was a small, almost imperceptible dent in the rear bumper, perhaps suggesting a minor skid or a tap against a low snow bank, but nothing that would have disabled the vehicle. Sergeant David Wells, the lead investigator who arrived on the scene, immediately recognized the profound shift in the case. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate, collective abandonment. Why would 5 grown men, some with coordination issues, leave a running, safe car with food and heat and walk into that? Wells murmured, sweeping his flashlight beam across the daunting, upward-sloping woods. The search immediately focused on the immediate vicinity of the car. The snow cover was patchy and frozen, but a set of distinct tracks were found, leading away from the car. The tracks were difficult to follow precisely, but they confirmed what Johnny Baxter had suspected. The 5 men had not walked down the road, back toward the main highway. They had walked north and sharply uphill, ascending toward the higher, more hostile elevation of the Kidd Creek Reservoir, a remote area known for its deep snowpacks and treacherous terrain, lying nearly 7 miles from the car. The tracks suggested they were walking single file, a common behavior for groups in deep snow, but also perhaps indicative of their familiarity with following a leader. The prints were shallow. They were not running or struggling, but walking with a definite, purposeful stride, almost as if they were following a set path or being guided. One disturbing detail emerged from the snow track analysis. Near where the Montego was found, they discovered a small, circular print, inconsistent with the men's shoes. It was too small, too regular. It was dismissed initially as a wild animal print or perhaps a fragment of a discarded tire tread. But to Sergeant Wells, it felt like an unsettling aberration, a tiny, almost subliminal anomaly in an already impossible scenario. The search teams organized into grid patterns and began the relentless, exhausting climb into the dark. The environment itself was becoming the primary antagonist. The snow was hip-deep in places, the cold was brutal, and the forest was an impenetrable maze of dense fir and pine trees. Helicopters were grounded due to low cloud cover and the extreme density of the canopy. The search was reduced to a brutal foot-by-foot slog through the wilderness. As the sun set on the day of the discovery, plunging the forest back into the sub-zero chill, the search found nothing but more silence. The last physical traces of the Yuba County Five vanished where the snow became too deep and the terrain too rugged for their ill-equipped shoes. The discovery of the car had answered the question of where they were, only to replace it with the infinitely more terrifying question of why they had chosen to leave, and what they had encountered on that lonely, isolated stretch of mountain road that was compelling enough to outweigh the instinct for survival. All eyes were now fixed on the northern slope. The men had walked into the jaws of the mountain, and the mountain was giving back no answers. The morning of March 1st dawned with a cruel, mocking clarity. The sky over the Sierra Nevada was a sharp, unrelenting blue, and the intense sunlight did little to alleviate the penetrating cold. Sergeant David Wells, leading the main search effort, stood at the base of the ridge, the very slope the 5 men had purposefully ascended 4 days earlier. His men were exhausted, their faces grimed with dirt and stress, but the discovery of the Montego had injected a fresh, desperate energy into the hunt. They now knew exactly where to look. The area was a relentless, vertical maze. The logging road had been rough, but the path the boys had chosen was a true climb, steep and dense with manzanita brush and thick stands of ponderosa pine. It was terrain that would challenge an experienced hiker in summer. For 5 men in light clothing and street shoes, some with limited mobility and intellectual capacity, it was a suicidal endeavor. Wells ordered the search party to follow the general line of the vanished footprints, focusing on the highest probable points of refuge. Logic dictated that if the men were seeking help or shelter, they would head for the highest visible landmark, perhaps a radio tower, or simply follow a straight line of ascent, believing they would find a road or a cabin on the other side. The ascent was brutal. For hours, the only sounds were the crunch of boots on frozen earth, the heavy, ragged breathing of the men, and the endless sighing of the wind through the tall, indifferent trees. The search was slow, painstaking, and utterly devoid of success. There were no discarded jackets, no lost wallets, no signs of a panicked struggle, nothing to indicate a disaster. The silence itself was the most unsettling clue. Around noon, one of the volunteers, a local forest ranger named Jim Holcomb, intimately familiar with the remote tracts of Plumas, called out, "Sergeant, up here." Near the south-facing slope, Wells scrambled toward the voice, his heart hammering against his ribs. Holcomb was standing near a prominent granite outcropping, pointing to a patch of ground sheltered by a cluster of fir trees. There, partially covered by drifting snow, were the first definite, chilling signs of the missing men. It was Jack Madruga's wallet. Wells knelt, pulling on thin forensic gloves. The wallet was intact, its leather exterior slightly stiff with frost. Inside, all of Jack's identification was present. His driver's license, his social security card, and crucially $22 in cash, a considerable sum for him. The fact that the money was untouched immediately threw cold water on the robbery theory that the sheriff's department had briefly entertained. If someone had taken them, they hadn't taken their money. But the discovery carried a more profound, disturbing implication. Why would Jack, a man known for his meticulousness, discard his wallet? It was more than a possession. It was his identity, his link to home. It suggested a sudden, overwhelming need to lighten his load, to move faster, or perhaps, a moment of profound confusion where his possessions ceased to matter. The grim discovery was quickly followed by another, even more visceral find, a few yards further up the slope. Holcomb pointed to a slight depression in the snow, partially melted and then refrozen. It was a pair of glasses, Teddy Weiher's prescription spectacles. Teddy was almost legally blind without his glasses. For him to be walking in this treacherous terrain, in pitch blackness, without them was incomprehensible. It was a sign of absolute panic, or a situation so instantly terrifying that he hadn't even had the presence of mind to protect his vision, a primary tool for survival. Wells looked from the wallet to the glasses, then back up the menacing slope. The artifacts were not clumped together, suggesting they hadn't been lost in a single fall or struggle. They were discarded, left behind at different points in their upward journey. They were moving fast or they weren't thinking clearly, Wells stated, his voice tight. They were jettisoning weight. But why climb? What were they trying to get away from? Or what were they rushing to? The trail of discarded items pointed relentlessly upward, reinforcing the men's original, baffling trajectory. The search teams pressed on, energized by the hope that these drops indicated the men were still together, maybe just disoriented, and that a structure or a clearing lay just ahead. As the afternoon wore on, the terrain flattened slightly into a high, wooded bowl, a natural depression filled with dense undergrowth. The temperature began to plummet again as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Wells knew they couldn't stay the night. The risk of hypothermia for his own men was too great. Just before he gave the order to descend, a final, horrifying clue was found. Beneath the roots of a giant, ancient cedar tree, Holcomb knelt down and let out a startled cry. It was a human shoe, a tattered, canvas sneaker, caked in mud and frozen snow. It was a size consistent with one of the missing men, but that wasn't the detail that stopped the investigators cold. The sneaker was severely damaged. The sole was torn half off, and the canvas was ripped in several places, but the tearing was not random. It was deliberate. Sergeant Wells examined the shoe under his flashlight. The rips looked like they had been made by a rough instrument, perhaps a rock or a jagged piece of wood, used to pry the shoe off the foot. And inside the shoe, adhering to the frozen lining, were small, viscous stains, dark, rusty brown, that Wells recognized instantly, even before the lab confirmed it. It was blood. The men hadn't just been disoriented or lost. They had been injured. Or, terrifyingly, someone had forced the shoe off, perhaps to immobilize them, or to take a grim trophy. Wells stood up, the damaged sneaker clutched in his gloved hand. The silent, empty woods no longer felt merely indifferent. They felt malevolent. The evidence, piece by frozen piece, was drawing a picture far darker than simple hypothermia or a wrong turn. It spoke of desperation, injury, and an urgent, terrifying pressure to move higher, faster, and farther into the mountain's embrace. "We pull out," Wells commanded, his voice barely a whisper against the vast silence. "But tomorrow we start at first light. We're close. Too close to turn back now." The mountain had yielded its first grim secrets. The Yuba County Five were no longer just missing. They were running, injured, and heading directly toward an unknown confrontation in the highest, loneliest reaches of the ridge. The first rays of the sun on March 2nd found Sergeant Wells and his team already high up on the ridge, exactly where they had paused their search the night before. They were fueled by cold coffee, adrenaline, and the visceral confirmation that the men had been there, alive and desperately struggling against an unseen force. The discovery of the damaged sneaker and Teddy's glasses had focused their search into a razor-sharp vector, pointing straight towards the summit. The hike took 2 punishing hours. They moved slowly, carefully scanning the ground for more discarded evidence. The landscape began to change. The dense, tangled underbrush gave way to a more open forest, dominated by massive, centuries-old pines, the snow cover becoming deeper and more consistent. The air here was impossibly thin and frozen, holding sound in a dense, unnatural silence. Then, just as the team began to hit a natural depression in the terrain, a small, sheltered valley, Jim Holcomb, the forest ranger, stopped dead in his tracks. "Wait," he whispered, holding up a gloved hand. "Look." Peeking through the bare branches of a distant thicket, something man-made broke the natural curve of the ridge. It was small, boxy, and utterly out of place. "A cabin," Wells breathed, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "Or a trailer. Maybe a shelter." It was a remote, dilapidated trailer, more of a permanent, customized tin shack, perched on the edge of the shallow valley. It was the kind of structure used by Forest Service workers, seasonal miners, or, as its general neglected appearance suggested, an isolated trapper or hermit. The discovery was a sudden, heart-stopping injection of hope and dread. Hope, because it represented shelter. Dread, because of what they might find inside after a week of freezing temperatures. The team moved in a cautious, professional sweep. As they approached, the full picture of the location came into focus. The structure was shielded on 3 sides by large pine trees, offering excellent protection from the wind. It was not locked. The front door, made of plywood and cheap tin, was slightly ajar, rattling softly in the icy breeze. Wells pushed the door open the rest of the way, revealing an interior cloaked in perpetual gloom. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old pine needles, rust, and the metallic odor of deep cold. Inside, the cabin was small and utilitarian. A rusty wood-burning stove, a collapsed cot, a makeshift shelf holding canned goods, and a scattering of old magazines. It was clearly occupied or at least recently used. The unsettling truth was that this location was the single most perfect place for 5 freezing men to seek refuge in a 40-mile radius. It offered heat, dryness, and, critically, food. Wells directed his flashlight beam to the canned goods shelf. The shelves were stocked with approximately a dozen cans of provisions, mostly non-perishable items like soup, beans, and peaches. In a corner, stacked neatly, were several blankets and a kerosene lantern. "They had everything here," Holcomb said, his voice laced with confusion. "Shelter, heat, food. If they made it this far, they should be." Holcomb didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Wells swept his light across the cot. The wool blanket was slightly disturbed, suggesting someone might have lain there briefly. Then, the light caught a pair of heavy, mud-caked boots standing neatly beside the cot, placed as if the owner had simply stepped out for a moment. They weren't the men's shoes. They were loggers' boots, size 11, belonging to the unknown resident of the cabin. Wells moved toward the stove. It was cold, the remnants of the last fire reduced to gray ash. He scraped the ash with a gloved finger. "This stove hasn't been lit in days," he stated. "Maybe since the storm hit last week." The team searched the small interior methodically. They found no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, just the eerie, suspended stillness of a place suddenly vacated. But then, as Wells was about to give the order to search the exterior perimeter, Officer Tim Brody, searching a small storage closet in the back, gasped, "Sergeant, in here!" Wells rushed to the closet. Brody was shining his light into the dark, dusty corner. Clustered together, shoved behind a stack of old tarps, were a few articles of clothing. They were soaked, frozen solid, and belonged to the missing men. 2 heavy parkas and 2 pairs of thick boots, all the correct size and brand matching the missing men's known apparel. Specifically, they identified a heavy, green parka belonging to Jack Madruga and a thick leather boot belonging to Bill Sterling. The presence of the discarded outerwear was a physical contradiction to the entire narrative. They had been freezing outside, walking into a blizzard, yet here they had removed heavy layers. Why discard the only thing keeping them alive after reaching shelter? "They took them off," Wells murmured, his mind reeling. "But why?" Brody pointed to the 2 heavy boots. "Look at the lining, sir. Inside the shaft." Wells directed his beam into the boots. The interior lining was crusted with ice and a dark, sticky residue. When he chipped away the ice, he saw it clearly. The same familiar, rusty brown bloodstains they had found on the tattered sneaker. More than that, the inner soles were stained with what looked like vomit or bile, a sign of extreme internal distress. The puzzle had become a grotesque, unsolvable riddle. 1. The men abandoned a warm car with food. 2. They walked 7 miles uphill into a desolate mountain range. 3. They found the perfect, stocked shelter. 4. They removed their protective clothing and boots inside the shelter, despite the sub-zero cold. 5. And then, having found sanctuary, they left. Wells looked at the abandoned stove, the full cans of beans, the neat stack of blankets, and the violently stained clothing. "They were inside this cabin," he said, his voice husky. "They were safe. Someone took off their clothes, or they took them off themselves because of what? Heat stroke? No, it's 40 below zero out there." Then, he turned his attention to the canned goods. He counted them again, 12 cans. A thought, cold and unsettling as the air, struck him. Brody checked the waste bin. See if any cans were opened. Brody searched the small metal bin by the stove. It was empty save for a few scraps of paper. "Nothing, Sergeant. No opened cans. No food waste. The food is untouched." Wells stepped back, rubbing the back of his neck. They had reached the cabin, found the supplies, found warmth, yet they had removed their clothing and left the food untouched. They had then stepped back out into the deadly cold, now even more vulnerable without their parkas and heavy boots. They didn't stay, Wells whispered, his gaze drawn to the open door. They changed clothes and kept going. But where? The search team fanned out from the cabin. This time, there were no easy tracks to follow. The new snow was too deep here. They had reached the end of the line, the final, maddening point of refuge, only to find it utterly abandoned, holding nothing but the promise of survival that the 5 men had inexplicably refused. The forest had swallowed the Gateway boys not once, but twice. The discovery at the trapper's cabin, the untouched food, the discarded yet blood-stained heavy clothing, the open door, sent a shockwave not just through the search team, but through the entire Oroville community. Sergeant Wells knew that the physical evidence had led them to a psychological dead end. Logic was useless here. To understand why they left the cabin, he had to understand who these men were, especially the quietest and most enigmatic of the group, Gary Mathias. Wells dispatched a small team to remain at the cabin, securing the perimeter against scavengers, both human and animal. He, however, drove back down the treacherous mountain road, heading not for the sheriff's office, but for the Gateway Center in Oroville and the homes of the Mathias family. He needed context, memory, and perhaps a hidden pattern. Gary Mathias, at 25, was physically the largest of the 5, known for his imposing, almost bear-like build, yet his presence was often the gentlest. He possessed a complex set of disabilities that made him extremely sensitive to noise and bright lights, often causing him to retreat into himself. But there was another facet to Gary, a history that set him apart from his 4 friends. Wells met with Gary's parents, a stoic, deeply religious couple whose grief was a tangible, heavy presence in their modest living room. They cooperated fully, their memories tumbling out in a stream of desperate hope. Gary, he was a worrier. His mother, Evelyn, recounted, clutching a worn photograph of her son. He didn't like changes. He loved his routine, his friends. But he was also restless sometimes. He would talk about hearing things. Hearing what, ma'am? Wells asked gently, leaning forward. Evelyn hesitated, looking at her husband. Voices, when he was under stress. Not malicious voices, not like that. More like calls. He'd say someone was calling his name from far away, urging him to go somewhere. The parents confirmed that Gary had been diagnosed with certain forms of mild auditory hallucinations, particularly when he was anxious or off his routine. The trip to Chico, the missed turn, the deep darkness of the mountain, all were cumulative stressors that could have amplified his condition. But the most significant detail emerged when Wells asked about Gary's history with the law, an embarrassing past event that the parents had tried to bury. In 1974, Gary had been involved in an incident that led to an involuntary psychiatric hold. He had been exhibiting paranoid behavior, culminating in him telling a psychiatrist that he was hearing divine guidance, instructing him to move toward a specific location in the northern mountains, a remote, sparsely populated area not unlike the very place he was now missing. He was trying to escape something, his father admitted, his voice rough with tears. Or maybe he thought he was running toward something. He was convinced, absolutely convinced, that a destination was waiting for him. A place of peace, he called it. This historical context painted the Montego's bizarre detour in a terrifying new light. Was the entire group's catastrophic deviation from the main highway not a simple mistake by Jack Madruga, but a silent, subconscious coercion guided by Gary Mathias? Did Gary, in a state of high stress and delusion, perhaps influence Jack to drive further into the wilderness, toward a place he believed he was meant to be? Wells thanked the family, his mind racing. The psychological path was as treacherous as the physical one. If Gary was leading them, he was leading them to a place that existed only in his mind. But why would the others, Jack, Bill, Teddy, and Jackie, follow him so blindly? The 4 other men, while intellectually disabled, were considered functioning adults. Yet they were also deeply reliant on a system of trust and routine. If Gary, the large, protective one, had suddenly acted on an internal, powerful compulsion, perhaps speaking with an unnerving authority the others rarely saw. Their instinct might have been to simply follow the leader, even a deeply disturbed one. Wells drove back up the mountain, the new information acting like a heavy, cold weight. He stopped at the place where the Montego was found. He walked the path again, slowly, trying to view the environment through Gary's eyes. The oppressive silence, the overwhelming blackness, the acute fear of the unknown. Did Gary hear a voice at the car, telling him to stop and walk? Did that same voice lead them past the warm, stocked cabin? The truth of the Cecil cabin was beginning to crystallize, not as a crime scene, but as a site of profound psychological failure. Gary, driven by his internal call, reaches the cabin. He sees the supplies, but the call is stronger than the instinct for survival. He is compelled to keep moving. He sheds his heavy clothing. Perhaps the layers of civilization and protection are now seen as hindrances to his urgent spiritual journey. He forces the others to do the same, stripping them of their defenses, preparing them for the next stage of the ascent. He hadn't found salvation in the cabin. He had found a brief, frustrating delay. Wells looked up the ridge toward the empty cabin. If Gary was the initiator, and he had pushed them past safety, the search was no longer about finding men lost in the woods. It was about finding men who had been guided into the wilderness by a voice that only one of them could hear. And that voice, Wells was convinced, had not yet led them to safety. The desperate search efforts in early March proved futile. Harsh winter conditions, repeated blizzards, and impenetrable terrain thwarted the search and rescue teams. The story of the Yuba County Five became a national headline. 5 men abandoned a full vehicle, food, and shelter, walked into the mountains, and vanished. Sergeant Wells and his team frantically searched every ravine, crevice, and tree line leading up from the Cecil cabin, but the deep snow cover swallowed every trace. The official search operation was suspended, and the case was reclassified from missing persons to probable losses due to exposure. The families were sent home, left with only despair and the agony of perpetual waiting. The North Yuba Mountains remained a cold, white tomb, holding 5 secrets within its vast silence. Months passed. The snow began its slow, melancholic retreat with the changing seasons. Thaws started in April, continued through May, and finally June arrived. On Sunday, June 4, 1978, that terrible silence was finally, accidentally, and excruciatingly broken. A group of motorcyclists from Yuba City were on a weekend excursion into the mountain wilderness. The leader of the group, Jack, branched off Highway 70, following trails that skirted the isolated, cursed logging road leading to the Cecil cabin. Late that afternoon, passing near an old Forestry Service utility trailer, Jack noticed a peculiar scent. It was sharp, unpleasant, and distinct from the smell of decaying animal or wet earth. Driven by morbid curiosity, he stopped to inspect the trailer. This specific trailer was located approximately 20 miles further into the wilderness than the previously discovered trapper's cabin, in an area known as the Middle Fork. It was used by the Forestry Service primarily for storing off-season equipment. Jack approached the trailer's rusted, dilapidated door. The hinges were loose, and there were signs the lock had been tampered with. He cautiously pulled the door ajar and looked inside. The sight that greeted him stole his breath and etched a horror onto his mind that would never fully fade. Inside the narrow confines of the trailer, slumped over the edge of a collapsed cot, was a human body, already far along in decomposition, infested with maggots and nearly skeletal. The body had been ravaged by a long winter of cold and moisture, rendering it unrecognizable. Jack immediately contacted authorities. Police helicopters and a forensic team led by Wells were dispatched to the Middle Fork area where the trailer was found. Sergeant Wells struggled to enter the trailer when he arrived. The stench was unbearable. Under the harsh light, the findings inside the trailer were both conclusive and unfathomable. The body was identified by clothing remnants. It was Teddy Weiher, one of the missing 5. Teddy's body was lying on its side, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, his face toward the wall. Initial findings suggested he had died from a combination of starvation and severe hypothermia. The estimated time of death was within a week of their disappearance. likely in the first days of March. However, the discovery brought with it 6 new, terrifying questions. 1. The trailer's food supply. On the shelves inside the trailer, there was a stock of unopened canned goods and a box of MREs, meals ready to eat. Teddy had sheltered in the trailer, yet he had not touched the food, starving to death right next to a full pantry. Why? 2. The matches. A box of matches was found on the floor right beside Teddy's body. The trailer had a gas stove and stocks of firewood were available nearby. Despite the freezing threat, he had made no attempt to start a fire. 3. The condition of his feet. Teddy was found with no shoes on his feet. This confirmed he must have left the Cecil cabin barefoot, turning his mountain journey into an act of unbelievable frenzy. 4. The forced lock. The trailer's exterior door had been locked. However, investigators determined that the lock had been broken from the inside, suggesting Teddy had forced his way in, and then either secured himself or someone else had locked him in from the inside upon their exit. 5. The blanket. One of the strangest details was his position. Teddy had lain down by the cot and wrapped himself completely in the blanket. This indicated he had been conscious and seeking comfort while preparing for death. 6. Medical findings. The autopsy revealed severe frostbite on his feet, extreme weight loss and dehydration, but no signs of physical trauma or external attack. Yet, there was one striking medical anomaly. Teddy's thyroid was abnormally swollen, which can be a sign of intense, last-minute exertion or severe panic. Wells stepped out of the trailer, gulping the cold, clear air. The discovery of the body did not explain the end of the five. Instead, it amplified the enigma of the cabin. Teddy had sought refuge, locked himself in, but refused food and heat. This was not a rational survival decision. It was an act of resistance against something. Teddy Weiher had entered the trailer not to be safe from the cold, but to hide from something, locking himself inside. What terrified him so profoundly that he could not avail himself of the food and heat right beside him? And most crucially, where were the other 4? While Teddy took shelter in the trailer, where had the other travelers on Gary Mathias's delusional path gone? Wells looked out at the muddy ground outside the trailer. He searched for new, fresh shoe prints emerging from the melting earth, but found none. There was only the mud and moisture brought by the thaw. Teddy's body was only the first of the 5 the mountain had yielded, carrying the first, terrifying whisper about the unhinged nature of the truth. The discovery of Teddy Weiher's body in the remote utility trailer on June 4th cracked the mountain's frozen silence, but it only deepened the chasm of mystery. Teddy had been miles from the Montego, miles from the Cecil cabin, having starved to death next to untouched food. Sergeant Wells and his team returned to the Middle Fork region, now focused on the horrific probability that the other 4 men, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jackie Hewitt, and Gary Mathias, lay scattered in the rapidly thawing wilderness. The search was brutal both physically and emotionally. The soft, muddy ground, freed from the snow's insulating blanket, was yielding, making the trek exhausting. The heat was now intense, and the advanced state of decomposition meant the air was heavy with the sickening, unmistakable odor of death, making the work torturous. On June 6th, 2 days after Teddy's discovery, a search team following a drainage ditch approximately a quarter-mile east of the utility trailer made the next finds. The ditch, a natural channel for melting snow, had served as a grim catch-all. Beneath a tangle of fallen logs and wet debris, they found 3 bodies, clustered together in the mud and pine needles. The level of decomposition was similar to Teddy's. They had died at the same time, likely succumbing to exposure and hypothermia during the first week of March. The grim identifications were made by a combination of remaining dental records, clothing, and the few personal effects left on the bodies. 1. Jack Madruga, the driver. 2. Bill Sterling, the optimist. 3. Jackie Hewitt, the youngest. The scene was one of overwhelming tragedy, yet it was the specific details of the bodies and their location that spoke volumes about their last moments, painting a picture far more disturbing than a simple group of men freezing to death. The terrible tableau. The bodies were found almost completely naked, They were covered only in shredded remnants of thin undergarments. Their heavy clothing, the parkas, sweaters, and even some socks, were nowhere to be found, reinforcing the terrifying behavior observed at the Cecil cabin. They had intentionally stripped off their protective layers in sub-zero temperatures. This phenomenon, known as paradoxical undressing, is sometimes observed in the final stages of hypothermia. As the core body temperature drops, the brain sometimes misinterprets the rush of blood back to the extremities as intense heat, causing the victim to frantically strip off clothes just before death. The bodies were evidence not just of cold, but of a final, intense, delirious confusion. Jack Madruga's final position. Jack's body was found lying slightly apart from the other two. His left shoulder was dislocated and badly bruised. Forensic experts later determined this was not an accidental injury from a fall, but a result of being struck or struggling violently before death. The injury suggested an intense, final physical confrontation or an act of self-harm in a desperate, hallucinatory state. Jackie Hewitt's condition. Jackie's body showed no immediate signs of external trauma, but the autopsy would later reveal severe internal bleeding in his lower abdomen, a potentially fatal injury on its own, caused by blunt force trauma. This injury was not consistent with a fall, suggesting a powerful, direct blow was delivered shortly before his death. Bill Sterling's demise. Bill was found face down, his hands frozen in a claw-like grip around a fallen pine branch. He had struggled the hardest against his final moments, his eyes wide open, glazed over and staring. His face was a mask of sheer, paralyzing terror. The scatter of the bodies was also critical. For men were now accounted for, but they had not died together. 3 were here, clustered in a shallow ditch, and Teddy was 20 miles away in a trailer. This implied a final dispersal after the Cecil cabin, or perhaps even a panicked flight in 2 directions. The missing ring and the final mystery. The investigators meticulously searched the area around the 3 bodies. They found small pockets of money untouched in their remaining pant pockets. The robbery theory was conclusively dead. However, a new mystery arose, one that focused entirely on Jackie Hewitt. Jackie, though the youngest, had been the most sentimentally attached to his personal possessions. He wore a distinctive gold watch and a family signet ring, items he never removed. Neither the watch nor the ring was found on his body or in the vicinity. They were not valuable enough to justify the sheer effort of the removal in such a frantic, desperate setting. The missing ring, coupled with the severe blunt force trauma to his abdomen, introduced a cold, clear thought that Wells had been avoiding. The final hours were not purely a battle against nature. The dislocated shoulder, the internal bleeding, the missing jewelry. It all pointed toward a brutal, final event involving an unseen force before the paradoxical undressing took hold. Where is Gary? With 4 bodies recovered, the focus intensified on the last missing man. Gary Mathias. The man whose past mental history and purported auditory calls offered the only logical, albeit terrifying, explanation for the group's initial decision to walk into the dark. Gary was not among the 3 in the ditch. He was not in the utility trailer with Teddy. The search teams redoubled their efforts, spreading outward from the ditch. They were now looking not for a lost man, but for the man who may have inadvertently led the others to their deaths. Gary Mathias's large, gentle frame and the keys to Jack's Montego, the keys he was last seen with, remained swallowed by the unforgiving mountain, holding the only definitive answers to the terrifying last moments of the Yuba County Five. The 4 bodies, Teddy Weiher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jackie Hewitt, were transported to the county coroner's office. Sergeant Wells, desperate for a solid, scientific explanation to counter the escalating local theories of alien abduction or cult activity, placed all his hopes on the forensic reports. He needed cold, hard facts to explain the paradoxical undressing, the untouched food, and the brutal injury to Jackie. The findings, however, did not provide clarity. They only wrapped the entire case in a deeper, more chilling enigma: the paradoxical undressing and delirium. The primary cause of death for all 4 men was confirmed as hypothermia, extreme exposure to cold. Yet, The forensic pathologist confirmed the phenomenon of paradoxical undressing had almost certainly occurred. In their final, desperate moments, the severe drop in core body temperature triggered a peripheral vasodilation, blood vessels near the skin suddenly widening, causing a terrifying sensation of extreme heat. Believing they were burning up, the men stripped off their life-saving clothes, a final, fatal act of delirium. But this psychological state did not fully explain the entire sequence of events. Of the unused food, the pathologist confirmed that all 4 men had died of starvation, extreme metabolic deficit, in addition to the cold. The fact that the abundance of food in the Montego and the canned goods in the 2 separate cabins remained untouched suggested a powerful, collective, and sustained psychological barrier to survival instincts. They were either too terrified, too disorganized, or too convinced of an immediate escape to focus on sustenance. The dehydration. Despite the abundance of snow and water sources from the thaw, all bodies showed signs of severe dehydration. They were unable or unwilling to ingest even snow, further cementing the idea that their cognitive function was completely shattered by fear or delusion. Jackie Hewitt's brutal injury. The most critical finding came from Jackie Hewitt's autopsy. The external trauma to his abdomen, the severe bruising and internal bleeding found in Chapter 7, was definitively identified as a non-fatal injury sustained shortly before death. It was the result of a forceful, direct blow, consistent with being struck by a heavy, blunt object, or a powerful, purposeful kick. Crucially, the pathologist ruled that this injury was not self-inflicted and was highly unlikely to have occurred accidentally from a fall onto a rock, given the specific location and depth of the trauma. This finding introduced a definite, undeniable element of human or external intervention into the case. Someone or something had violently struck Jackie before he succumbed to the cold. The silent witness, Jack Madruga's shoulder. Jack Madruga's dislocated shoulder, Chapter 7, was also scrutinized. While it could have been caused by a struggle, the forensic team noted that Jack was an exceptionally strong man, and the force required to dislocate his shoulder in this manner was immense. More perplexing, Jack's teeth showed signs of severe scraping and wear on one side, as if he had been grinding them constantly or chewing on an extremely hard, non-food object in his final days. This supported the theory of extreme, prolonged psychological stress and anxiety. The missing piece, Gary. As the findings solidified the sheer terror and the likelihood of external violence in the men's final hours, the absence of Gary Mathias, the one man whose known auditory hallucinations offered a link to the mountain itself, became the terrifying anchor of the case. Wells received a chilling phone call from the lead pathologist. "Sergeant, these men died in a state of absolute fear and confusion. They were stripped, starving, and one was violently assaulted. The mountain didn't just freeze them. Something drove them mad first. And the one man who might tell us what that something was is still out there, with the keys to the car." The physical evidence from the 4 recovered bodies led to an impossible conclusion. The men had survived the environment only to be undone by a combination of delusion, driving them away from safety, and a violent, unidentified confrontation, leading to injury and further panic. The puzzle was no longer about finding the missing. It was about finding Gary Mathias and the truth of what he had heard, what he had seen, and whether he was a victim or the accidental catalyst of a nightmare. The autopsies had delivered a horrifying conclusion. The Yuba County Five had been defeated not by the severity of the cold alone, but by a combination of profound cognitive failure and unexplained external trauma. The focus now shifted from the deceased to the last living piece of the puzzle. Gary Mathias and the last known item he possessed, the keys to the turquoise Mercury Montego. Sergeant Wells returned to the isolated logging road where the Montego had been found in February. The scene was now marked by yellow tape and the remnants of forensic markers. The Montego, towed away long ago, left behind only the impression of its tires and the chilling silence of its abandonment. Wells had meticulously reviewed the initial police reports. Jack Madruga had owned the car and was the designated driver. Yet, when the car was found, the key was missing. It wasn't in the ignition, nor was it found on Jack's body months later in the ditch. The key was a concrete object that must have been handled by one of the men during the critical moments of abandonment. The working theory, based on the discovery of the Montego's registration in Jack's discarded wallet. Chapter 3 was that Jack was the one who initially stopped the car. However, the subsequent removal of the keys, an irrational act that guaranteed no return, had to be the final, destructive act of the group's mental breakdown. Wells had a sudden, cold realization. Gary Mathias was the only one physically capable of preventing Jack from driving the car back. Gary was the gentle giant, but also the largest and strongest man in the group. If the call he was hearing became an irresistible, urgent command to move up the mountain, Jack, the meticulous driver, would have been the one to resist, pointing to the safe car, the warm engine, the food. Scenario reconstruction. 1. Jack stops the car. Why? Jack stops the car for an unknown reason. Perhaps he saw something, perhaps he was coerced by Gary's sudden, intense authority, or perhaps they encountered a brief light or sound that forced the stop. 2. The ascent begins. Gary, driven by his delusion, demands they ascend the ridge. 3. The keys, to ensure no one goes back, especially Jack, who would instantly try to restart the engine. Gary takes the keys. By removing the ability to drive, Gary forces the group to commit to the ascent, fulfilling the demand of the voices only he could hear. If Gary held the keys, he was the de facto leader of the final, fatal march. The other four, dependent on Gary's familiar, yet suddenly commanding presence, simply followed. They followed him past the point of no return at the Montego, past the safety of the Cecil cabin, and toward their scattered, tragic end. A new witness emerged. As Wells sat in his car, overlooking the desolate scene, his radio crackled to life with a message that shattered the tranquility and the established timeline. A man named Joseph Shans, a retired plumber living near the Oroville foothills, called in, prompted by the renewed media coverage following the recovery of the four bodies. Shans claimed he had a direct, terrifying encounter with the missing men on the night of February 24th, just hours after they were last officially seen. Shans lived near the remote road where the Montego was eventually found. He told investigators that on the night the men vanished, his truck had become stuck in a snowdrift near his property around 11:30 p.m. He was frantically trying to free it when, suddenly, a light beam cut through the intense darkness. It was Jack's turquoise Mercury Montego. Shans flagged them down, desperate for help. He claimed the driver, who must have been Jack Madruga, initially pulled over, but then, inexplicably, looked agitated and drove off, ignoring his plea. Minutes later, Shans heard the Montego return. This time, it didn't stop. It sped past him and then stopped further down the road, the exact location where the car was eventually found. Shans then reported the most terrifying detail. "I heard voices," Shans recounted to Wells later. "Loud voices. People shouting. I thought maybe they were fighting. And then I heard a man crying out. It was a cry of pain or terror. And then a voice I didn't recognize. It was calm, authoritative. It said, 'We're going to keep going. We're going to keep going.'" Shans also reported seeing another vehicle, a large, dark pickup truck, parked near the Montego for a brief time before it sped away down the mountain. The discovery of the four bodies, the bloodstains, and the internal trauma to Jackie Hewitt suddenly aligned perfectly with Shans's chilling account. The fight, the pain, and the departure of the mysterious dark truck suggested the five men had encountered someone else on that lonely road. A confrontation occurred, resulting in the trauma observed on Jack and Jackie. But the final, calm, authoritarian voice telling them to keep going had to be Gary Mathias, taking charge after the altercation, his delusion reinforced by the panic, holding the keys like a sacred relic of his ultimate, fated journey. The lost keys were no longer just a symbol of irrationality. They were the weapon used to secure the obedience of four frightened men, guaranteeing their continued, fatal ascent into the dark mountain. The testimonies of Joseph Shans, the plumber, had introduced the terrifying possibility of a confrontation on the lonely road, explaining the trauma found on Jack and Jackie. The lost keys, now firmly believed to be in Gary Mathias's possession, became the key to understanding the group's forced, delusional ascent. But where was Gary? The man who held the answers to the confrontation, the leader of the fatal march, remained the mountain's deepest secret. The massive summer search effort, revitalized by the discovery of the 4 bodies, now focused solely on finding Gary. Investigators pored over aerial photos and grid maps, using the locations of Teddy's trailer and the ditch where the 3 were found to triangulate Gary's likely trajectory. He had walked further than his friends, or perhaps he had simply chosen a different path in the final moments of the group's chaotic dispersal. Days turned into a week. The scent of pine and damp earth was heavy, but the air no longer carried the overwhelming odor of decomposition, a sign that Gary was not in the immediate vicinity of the others. Sergeant Wells was losing hope. If Gary had survived the initial exposure, the mountain must have consumed him quickly. He was, after all, wandering barefoot and without warm clothing, guided only by phantom voices. Then, on a Tuesday morning, a patrol team working far north of the Middle Fork region, near a high-elevation stream called Grizzly Creek, radioed in a discovery. They had found the last, most perplexing piece of evidence tied to the Yuba County Five. It was a small, canvas item, partially buried under a mound of loose rock and muddy soil, not far from the stream. Wells immediately recognized it from the missing persons reports. It was Gary Mathias's boot. The boot was a heavy, military-style canvas boot, known to be worn by Gary. It was intact, preserved by the mud, and definitively confirmed to belong to the final missing man. The discovery ended the search for Gary's path. He had continued north, higher into the wilderness, far beyond where his friends had collapsed and died. But the most disturbing detail was not the boot itself, but what was found inside it. When the forensic officer carefully sifted the contents of the mud and detritus, his fingers closed around a familiar piece of frozen metal. It was a single silver-colored key on a small metal loop. It was Jack Madruga's Montego key. Gary Mathias had kept the key, the physical instrument of the group's doom, for his entire journey, carrying it far past the point where the car, and the hope of returning to it, were long forgotten. He had discarded his boot, possibly due to severe frostbite or his own paradoxical undressing, and left the key behind, a strange, almost ritualistic deposit in the dirt. The discovery painted a final, tragic picture of Gary's journey. 1. The leader, Gary, driven by his internal voice and possessing the key as a tool of coercion, led his friends past safety. 2. The split. At some point after the Cecil cabin, the group fractured. Teddy, weak and terrified, found the utility trailer and locked himself in. The other 3, Jack, Bill, and Jackie, stumbled on toward the ditch, perhaps still following Gary's voice, until they collapsed from exhaustion and the onset of fatal delirium. 3. The solo ascent. Gary, the strongest, continued his solitary pilgrimage. He walked for many more miles, until he shed his final piece of protective gear, his boot, and left behind the key, signaling that his true destination, his true peace, was imminent and no longer needed the crutch of civilization's instruments. Gary Mathias was never found. The mountain had yielded its dead, but not the man who led them there. The last trace, the lone boot and the final key, was located deep in the high country, pointing toward the still unconquered wilderness of the Plumas National Forest. The key was the final testimony. Gary had been the conductor of this silent, frozen symphony of death. He had led 4 men to their end, and then walked toward his own, carrying the truth of the last moments, the confrontation, the voices, and the ultimate irrational decision to die freezingly in a mountain paradise. The fate of the Yuba County Five was a tragic intersection of environmental exposure, undiagnosed psychological illness, and a dark, final encounter that the cold, indifferent mountains refused to surrender. To be continued.